This is Catherine Neal, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about the influence of ethical leadership on group and individual decision making. How can we make ethical decisions as members of a group? And how, if we are in a leadership position, can we influence members of groups to make ethical decisions? Throughout our careers, all of us will find ourselves in leadership roles, whether that be in formal positions of authority or informal positions of authority. And as leaders, we have great influence over how decisions are made and what decisions are made by our organization. So what we're going to think about throughout this lecture is how can we influence others to make ethical decisions. Hopefully you've had time to read the Harvard Business Review article, The Parable of the Sadhu. This article was written by a banker named Bowen McCoy. People called him Buzz McCoy. He worked for a financial institution called Morgan Stanley, and part of his employee benefits was a sabbatical. A sabbatical is when you get an extended leave from your normal work duties to go off and pursue other interests, whether they're professional or personal. So Buzz McCoy, during his sabbatical from Morgan Stanley, went on a mountain climbing trip to the Himalayas. And just as a matter of background, if you're unfamiliar with mountain climbing excursions, these for most people are a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It takes several weeks of your time to complete one of these excursions, and they're quite expensive. Anywhere from $80,000 to $120,000, and that's barring any type of complications that you might have during your excursion. So this is what he decided to do with his time on his sabbatical. The group he climbed with ran into an unexpected crisis and reacted to that crisis in a way that seemed to haunt Buzz McCoy, so much so that when he got home from his trip, he continued to think about it and ultimately wrote this article about what happened to them on the mountain. I think that he was unhappy and dissatisfied with how his group reacted and thought that they could have done better in a time of crisis. And he thought there was much to learn and applicable to making decisions in a business environment. And so if you have not read the article, The Parable of the Sadhu, please take the time to do so because there's a lot to learn there. In his article, McCoy wrote about indicators that ethical decision making will take place within an organization. And he found that strong leadership was the most important indicator that an organization will behave ethically. Strong ethical leadership. He said that it's impossible for an organization to act ethically without ethical leadership. And that strong ethical leadership is one of the most important factors in creating and maintaining an ethical organization. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be a strong ethical leader, and how can we be strong ethical leaders? Now, as you know, much of the decision making that happens in an organization is in groups or in teams. It's not that one individual gets to make decisions for the organization without reliance on others in the organization. Making decisions in a group makes the decision-making process more complicated. It can make it more effective, but in the process it's quite difficult because you've got the thoughts and opinions of several people instead of just one individual. So how can you, if you're a member of a group, influence the group to make ethical decisions? And how, if you are the leader of the group, can you influence groups to make ethical decisions? Before we begin looking at the traits of a strong ethical leader, I want to reference the Tylenol crisis of 1982. If you're not familiar, in 1982, 8 people in the greater Chicago area died suddenly, and pretty quickly law enforcement discovered that the deaths were attributable to cyanide-laced extra-strength Tylenol capsules. Someone, and they didn't know immediately when the capsules were tainted, but they knew that all 8 people who died took extra strength Tylenol capsules immediately before their deaths. Let's take a look at this quick video to give you some background about how Johnson & Johnson, the company that owns the brand Tylenol, handled the crisis at the time.
About this time, the fall of 1982, in I think at least one supermarket in Chicago, that the best they can figure, someone injected cyanide into the tablets, and several people in the Chicago area ended up dying, and it created quite a panic, not only in the Chicago area, but because Tylenol was such a successful brand throughout the country. Their legal counsel, and from what I heard, the FBI as well, said maybe you shouldn't recall this product when that came up as a discussion point, because this will look like some crazy person can bring a major corporation to its knees. So James Burke, who was then the CEO, in consultation with his top executives, did in fact withdraw Tylenol, and not only did they withdraw it from the shelves, they promoted the fact that they were withdrawing it. It was on all the news programs. But the point Burke made was their credo, which is a well-known document put forth by Robert Wood Johnson, who was the founder of J&J in the 40s, has 4 paragraphs. The first sentence of their first line of the first paragraph says, we are responsible to the doctors, nurses, patients, mothers, fathers, others who use our product. And Burke's point was, we were violating the first line of the credo, and therefore he said we wanted to pull the product off the market. Yes, I think it's not only viewed as a textbook example in the crisis management area, but in my field of business ethics, I think it's the gold standard by which other similar kinds of decisions are evaluated, because J&J quickly recalled the product, brought the product off the market, and then in a number of months re-entered the product or reintroduced the product with an advertising campaign. And I think that this is something that we can learn from today, that having at least empathy for consumers and understanding that if there's consumer health and safety issues, you need to go that extra mile. As an ethics professor, I don't think it is, but I know in actual fact it sometimes is. When there's a lot of pressure by Wall Street, or pressure to make the numbers in the short term, cutting corners, or if you can get away with not doing a recall. I'm not going to sit in judgment of Mattel, but maybe they were a little reluctant to do recall because it involves so many of their products. But I believe there's so much pressure, the market, financial markets, as well as competition. But executives need to think about the long term, and I think that's what Johnson & Johnson, that's why we're still talking about it 25 years later. They could see the long-term implications of them hiding the issue. They couldn't hide the fact that people died, but maybe hiding behind saying this is a good brand, we didn't do anything wrong. Rather, they took it upon themselves to be proactive, and I think that's another reason that being long-term oriented and being proactive and being transparent are all things that executives should consider.
So we're going to, as we walk our way through some ideas about how to behave as strong ethical leaders, we're going to consider Jim Burke of Johnson & Johnson and his actions at the time of the Tylenol crisis as an example and as the gold standard of expected ethical behavior in the business environment. How can we act as ethical leaders? The first action that individuals can take as ethical leaders is to create standards for behavior. Adopt and disseminate standards of behavior to make sure everyone knows what the expectations are, to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And if we think about Johnson & Johnson and our credo, this is a one-page, pretty simple document that was drafted in 1948, written in plain language that relates to everyday concerns of managers in the organization. And this is a code or a code of conduct that Johnson & Johnson has lived with and lived by for decades and has been quite successful for them in providing guidance when an ethical dilemma arises. So this is a good example of when ethical leaders create standards of behavior, and this can lead to better ethical decision making in an organization. Ralph Larson, a former chairman and CEO of Johnson & Johnson, said, "We wrestle with problems that have no easy answers, no clear right or wrong. For all those leadership challenges, our core values also make leadership a whole lot easier. Our credo implicitly tells us what's important: honesty and integrity, respect for others, fairness and straight dealing. Those are the ethical values on which we operate all over the world." Here's a link to our credo. As I mentioned, it is a pretty simply written one-page document that has been in existence for quite some time. When Jim Burke made decisions during the Tylenol crisis, when he pulled every bottle of Tylenol off of every shelf in the United States, costing the company tens of millions of dollars, in addition to hurting consumer confidence in the product, he relied on the first line of our credo when making his decision. We believe our first responsibility is to the patients, doctors, and nurses, to mothers and fathers, and all others who use our products and services. He said our credo made it easy for him to make what was a very costly decision for the company. In the parable of the Sadhu, Bowen McCoy writes about this issue of having standards for behavior. One of our problems was that as a group, we had no process for developing a consensus. We had no sense of purpose or plan. The difficulties of dealing with the Sadhu were so complex that no one person can handle them. Because the group did not have a set of preconditions that could guide its actions to an acceptable resolution, we reacted instinctively as individuals. The cross-cultural nature of the group added a further layer of complexity. We had no leader with whom we could all identify and in whose purpose we believed. An effective leader can't run from risk either. He or she has to confront risk. To feel safe in doing that, managers need the guidelines of an agreed upon process and a set of values within an organization. So, ethical leaders create standards for behavior, guidelines of an agreed upon process and a set of values within the organization. Organizations that do not have a heritage of mutually accepted shared values tend to become unhinged during stress, with each individual bailing out for himself or herself. Isn't stress the real test of personal and corporate values? The instant decisions that leaders make under pressure reveal the most about personal and corporate character. So best practice would be to always have and create and live by standards of behavior. But as a leader, you must also consider, what do you do when you run into a situation that isn't covered by written or formal rules? How then do you decide between what's right and wrong? Next, best practice. Ethical leaders communicate their commitment to ethics. Leaders need to do more than just act ethically. They must advocate and disseminate the ethical decision-making process. At Johnson & Johnson, they have Credo Challenge meetings, which are held twice a year for new top managers. Ralph Larson said, "I knew that we had programs in place to help ensure that each new employee had read it and was told of its significance, and I knew that copies of it were displayed in offices and plants all over the world." So creating and having guidelines is not enough. You must communicate commitment to those ethical guidelines. Interesting study. The results of this study say that in business articles, CEOs of large companies mention ethics or social responsibilities in only about 5% of their communications, compared to the discussion of financial matters in 40% of their communications. So business leaders talk a lot more about money than they do about ethics. Third best practice, ethical leaders engage in visible ethical actions. Leaders must model the ethical decision-making process. For example, Jim Burke, during the Tylenol crisis, he modeled an ethical decision-making process. He said, not pulling Tylenol off the shelf would have violated the credo. It would have been hypocrisy at its best and worst. So leaders should openly use ethical decision-making processes. They should talk about it in meetings in the presence of large and small audience. Think about what effect visible ethical actions by a leader would have had on the group of mountain climbers in their treatment of the sadhu. Would it have changed what they did and how they did it? Fourth best practice. Ethical leaders reinforce desired conduct. Compliance with an organization's standards for behavior should be expected and rewarded. Ralph Larson, again, of J&J, said, "Leaders can make values a priority that get measured and rewarded. We can work hard at making sure that the company's values are well expressed, well understood, explicit, and visible in all we do, in all of our programs, policies, and products. But the most important thing is to set the proper personal example, the tone at the top." Non-compliance with codes of conduct should be addressed. At J&J, when some senior executives were found to have had expense account improprieties, they were fired immediately. News of ethical violations and the subsequent terminations was communicated throughout the company, noting that the actions violated the credo. So measuring and rewarding compliance with codes of conduct and having policies and procedures in place to deal with violations of the codes of conduct. The fifth best practice, ethical leaders collaborate with others. Ethical leaders need many advisors and surround themselves with answers. They keep a circle of advisors open and fluid. They use trustworthy and expert advisors that contribute to the situation. And they ask others to challenge decisions. They don't just surround themselves with people who say yes all the time. Collaboration helps with problem identification, information gathering, and can help leaders guard against oversimplifying a complex ethical decision. Sixth best practice. Ethical leaders are team players. They set aside issues of turf. They give potential successors opportunities to exercise and build their leadership. They think about the future of the organization, not just today. They personally mentor those who will follow them in leadership positions. And a quote from the famous coach, Vince Lombardi, individual commitment to a group effort, that is what makes a team work, a company work, a society work, a civilization work. Leaders who encourage freedom of inquiry, support personal values, and reinforce a sense of direction can fulfill the need to combine individuality with the prosperity and success of the group. Without such support, the individual is lost. In a complex corporate setting, the individual requires and deserves the support of the group. When people cannot find such support in their organizations, they don't know how to act. So, a review. The 6 best practices for being a strong ethical leader that can encourage ethical behavior in an organization. Number 1, establish standards of behavior. Number 2, use those standards openly, talk about them to others when you're making decisions. 3, be an example, practice what you preach. Number 4, provide praise for those who act ethically and negative consequences for those who don't. Number 5, collaborate with others. And number 6, be a team player.